So trust is absolutely imperative. And I would trust someone who came to me and said, hey, I think we might not have got this 100% right. I think we can do with some recalibration. Can we work with you on that? They got my trust.
Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, a podcast about the business of doing good. I'm Charlie Martin, your host and founder of TrueMark, the mark of trusted sustainability reports and communications. And our article this week is titled, Scotiabank, RBC, retire 2030 emissions targets in climate strategy overhaul, which was published by Net Zero Investor in 2026. And reports on how two of Canada's biggest banks have walked away from their interim financed emissions targets, with Scotiabank also dropping its 2050 net zero goal entirely, citing shifting policy environments and a broader investor pullback from climate commitments. And I'm absolutely thrilled to say that today I've got not only a real expert in the room, but both a dog lover and a rugby lover, which means that we're getting on like a house on fire. But I've managed to get Charlie Bronks, an expert in governance, sustainability, and stakeholder trust in financial services. She's Group Head of Responsible Business at Crown's Agents Bank, a board trustee at the UN Global Compact Network UK, and an advisory board member at ESG Mark. Charlie, it sounds like you've got a hell of a lot on your plate. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time to join me today.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm quite excited, really. I think we've got a lot to talk about. Our problem is that we're not going to have long enough, so I guess we've got to edit down.
Well, that'll be it. But also, Charlie, I mean, thinly veiled here, but hopefully you have such a wonderful time on the show that we can start a kind of a Charlie Bronx mini-series. That's what my hope is. Anyway, now, Charlie, I briefly introduced this article, and I want to get your kind of more thorough sort of breakdown of what it covers. But I actually, before we do that, just want to start with my own like personal reflection on this. I found this to be one of those things that you read and you just think, especially with how the way that both banks have sort of shifted towards the more kind of performative, if you like, metric of investment in low carbon transitioning companies, as opposed to dealing with the overall carbon emission kind of basis that their investments sort of, facilitate. I found that to be incredibly saddening to read. Now, have I understood this article correctly in light of what's going on here? Or perhaps you could just give us your expert view on what the piece covers.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective. I mean, I had to read it a few times. Often I'll read it and then I'll go back and read it again and think, right, what have I missed here? But what interested me most about the article was that the obvious headline is that RBC and Scotiabank have retired their interim financial emissions targets. But with Scotiabank also withdrawing its financed emissions and net zero goal, the most interesting question is what it says about the evolution of sustainability itself, rather than thinking that two organizations are actually dialing back. I don't really see this, having reread it a few times, as evidence that the underlying challenges has gone away. Climate risk clearly hasn't disappeared. Look at the scenario we're in here now in London. And the transition challenge hasn't disappeared. Look at all the regulatory requirements and what we're seeing globally, not just within the UK. What's changed, I think, is the environment in which organizations are operating. The article really highlights changing policy assumptions around regulatory dynamics, data availability, market conditions, all as factors influencing how the banks have approached their targets. I think that's a big part of it. And I think it's really easy for us to sort of see these articles and go, react. But sometimes what is informing that? It may be that they've got investor pressure or pressure overseas, and where they're trying to operate in a new market and they don't like the terminology. I mean, we're called responsible business for a reason. For me, the more interesting discussion is whether sustainability is entering a more mature phase. But I am an optimist. I'm a glass half full, but I always think the more you believe in luck, create opportunity, the luckier you get. And I also think that maybe we're entering a new sustainability phase. Maybe over the last decade, we've arguably seen a few phases. We've seen awareness. We've seen commitments. we're looking at delivery, and maybe there's been a lot of words.
And Charlie, but I mean, that was really interestingly framed, but I am just going to, like, if you forgive me, just push back slightly on this, that this isn't just a terminology issue here. These banks are ultimately, have significant influence in terms of where they choose to lend their money, where they choose to invest their money. And are they not providing themselves with the opportunity here to essentially prop up the status quo and essentially just begin to invest more and more of their money back into, oil and gas, etc.? Like, is that not what the implication of this?
Yeah, I think it's part of it, but I think there's a bigger piece here as well, and that is that transition piece as well. And we had it when we were going through our B Corp certification. Sometimes by being in certain markets, by dealing with when you're working in countries that are making decisions that perhaps you don't have to make when you're in a market that perhaps it isn't facing the same complications and challenges. It's easier to make those decisions because you're blessed with that opportunity. But when you're in a market where you're trying to deliver, and you've got a lot of people demanding and working with some of your clients and doing what's in the best interest of your clients, in certain jurisdictions, the central bank and the government may be making their money looking at they have to work with extractives. Now, there's a transition plan within that, and they can be part of that transition. But at the time, coming out of it completely doesn't necessarily stop the problem. Being part of the change is, I think, I think that's what we're going to see a lot more of, where companies, for example, are saying, we're going to be involved in that, but this is the risk profile. This is the approach we're going to take. This is how we're going to do it. This is going to be a proportionate approach, making sure that we don't engage in nefarious activity, obviously, but in a way where we can be part of that transition. We know that, looking at what we're having, the geopolitical scenarios that we're in at the moment is forcing certain changes, whether we like it or not. But what it's done is made us look at some of those extractives and the dependencies, and also look at other energy provision and where we might get those. So the demands are constantly changing, and we're in an era, I think, where we're facing many different challenges. It's very difficult to go in and make an absolute, you can't do this. And if a company does that, that's a cancel culture. I think it's worth understanding what those underlying sort of challenges are. And I don't know what their underlying challenges are. It's not clear from the article. They may be working with some of those governments and have made a commitment. If so, they've got some work to do around some of the storytelling, but that is what we're going to see over the next few years. So I think I'm really cautious of criticizing something that I don't know enough about. That article piece, I think, is a trend that we're seeing, and it's definitely challenges that we all face when we're looking at businesses. We're looking at opportunities in an environment like we are now, where we're looking at revenue. We're not charities. We've got to find a way to make money and work and look after all stakeholders and do what's in the best interest of. But also, we're very aware of some of those decisions and the ramifications of. So I'd say that the transition piece is an important part of the puzzle that's perhaps not addressed as heavily as it might be.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It kind of feels like it talks about the kind of either end of the spectrum, if you like. It talks about, I guess, growth in transition finance and the fact that that's the sort of justification of, no, we are investing in these, alternatives, and we're investing in the future in that way. And on the other end, sort of looking at those overall kind of emissions targets associated with their overall lending. And that actually, to your point, there is the transition that lenders and banks need to go on, and financial institutions, in order to essentially sort of change their book, if you like, and that's not going to happen overnight, and that needs to be sort of realistic and sympathetic to the world that we live in. Is that the essence what you're saying?
I think the article really looks at the pressures around regulation, the limitations, the climate commitments. But the interesting question is why are they withdrawing? Now, I think part of that is because they've realized that some of those commitments that we've all made and what you've seen, some of them, you can't, some of them were very aspirational or perhaps unrealistic. And there seems to be, right now, people worrying about what to do with that. And I guess this really plays into your expertise and your area, Charlie, certainly around greenwashing and green hushing. And I think how an organization really approaches this, because I think a massive strength of an organization is revisiting something and saying, hey, looking at the world we've got now and the business model that we've got, that we don't think this is going to be realistic. How can we do better? And how can we reestablish a better baseline or look at this with a different lens and work with the right partners in order to do that? I think that's a strength. And I think that could be what we're saying here. I think the transition piece is a massive part of it. And I think there could be it's the dearth between commitments and delivery. And that transition piece is something that we're all sort of facing. And also banking has such an important role in that transition finance piece that maybe there are elements there that haven't been communicated as well as they might within this.
Like what you're saying is that we're just this is just a representative of us just getting a little bit more real, if you like, when it comes to and pragmatic around sustainability. Less of I think the article alluded to kind of the Paris Spring, if you like, where we all got very giddy and excited and set these very, very optimistic targets. And essentially we're just getting into a phase where we're communicating more transparently. We're being a bit less aspirational and a bit more realistic in terms of the way that we approach sustainability. Is that how it is?
Yeah, we got very excited, and I think it's brilliant that we did. You know, it was like, what did you want to be when you grew up? I had lots of ideas. I can assure you, I'm none of them at the moment. I think architect was one, and Stumpleman was another. That's never going to happen. I'm way past that. But when you're looking at what this means, you know, it's the same. It's the same principle. What do we want? We want to do better. I mean, who gets out of bed thinking, how can I do a bit worse every day? This is about that principle. I think as businesses, we are looking about how we do better and incremental pieces as well. We went hard. We all went aspirational and heavy, but those commitments aren't necessarily always achievable in the way that we've described them. So I think there's some work to do on delivery, and that's what we're going to be seeing. That's certainly what I think we're going to be seeing. And it's what I'm really focusing on at the moment.
That's really interesting. And I want to talk about how like this applies, like this sort of scenario, circumstance that we find ourselves in with banking more generally, like how that affects your work at CAB. But before I do that, I just want to ask like one question on like trust and the impact or not of these sorts of commitments from these banking institutions being rolled back publicly. Like, the banking sector, again, from the financial crisis in 2008, like obviously trust has become a huge marker for, for the financial services sector. What impact, if anything, does these sorts of rollbacks have on perceptions of trust in our banks?
Right. My answer to this is I've thought long and hard about this, and I think it is absolutely critical. And the reason being, trust, certainly for us and the way I approach responsible business and looking at some of our clients and some of the challenges that they're facing in some pretty serious markets that are facing geopolitical and climate change impact. What I'd say, trust piece is absolute. And it's fine if you change. It's fine if you decide to say, this isn't achievable. We realized when we set these goals 5-10 years ago that we wanted to be able to do that, but this isn't right for the business model because of these reasons. Can we work with you? Can we work with our stakeholders? Look at your double materiality assessments. Go in and really, really engage the tools that you've got, and the staff. Your staff are your biggest strength, and your clients. Find out what's important to them, because it could be that my commitments don't help my clients at all. But when you set them 5-10 years ago and you didn't do a double materiality around what was important for your clients, does that meet with your strategic objectives? And then look at the regulation. Now, within the banking system, we have phenomenal regulation. We have a lot of frameworks that we work to, and reporting, and great reporting standards. And I think you've got to make sure that everything fits and works together, and you're not working against yourself or the regulation or the ratings or the strategy, and that it works for your clients. There's a lot of stakeholders within that you've got to make sure are all on the same page, and that you're meeting the delivery and the expectations of your own company strategy and what you're trying to achieve. So trust is absolutely imperative. And I would trust someone who came to me and said, hey, I think we might not have got this 100% right. I think we can do with some recalibration. Can we work with you on that? They got my trust.
And I totally agree with that Charlie, but let me pose this. It's one thing having to do that once. Mm-hmm. It's perhaps another thing having to do that twice. But doesn't trust become a real issue if the goalposts are continually shifting and changing and these targets are continually shifting and changing? Is that something that when you look at, I'm not want to specifically ask about CAB, but when you look at the banking sector as a whole, do you think that there's a danger that might be the reality we're heading down? Or do you think it's just people have short memories and they're okay with things shifting as they do?
Listen, I don't think it helps. I really don't think it helps. I think people that have strong trust and they say what their commitments are and they deliver on those. And if they can't deliver completely, they explain. I think I would trust them more than someone who comes to me and says, right, they're going to do this 100%. We're going to do this over here. It would drive you mad and frustrating. So that's why the way we're looking at it here is as a commercial differentiator, as a competitive advantage to say, this is the standard we're going to hold ourselves to. This is how we're going to operate. This is our strategy and this is what we're going to deliver. And it's all about the delivery, that social piece, which is quite difficult for a wholesale bank, which is the sort of focus and the driver that we've had very much since inception.
And out of interest, Charlie, just talking about how that, like what you've just described there, like how that influences in the way that CAB goes about kind of setting its own targets and its own goals and objectives. Like, does what you've just suggested like mitigate the type of scenario that these two banks in Canada have gone through in terms of having to turn around at a certain point and go, guys, actually, what we previously committed to, the standard we previously held us to, is no longer fit for purpose, and we're now changing it? Is that?
I mean, their particular scenario, it may be that they're just recalibrating. I don't know. I don't know the ins and outs there. I can only speak for us in terms of the way, I think I would probably find it frustrating if I was their CSO. I think that would be probably, why are we changing this? Or we need a narrative around this. And I think it is about explaining. It's about keeping people on the story. And, it's very easy to make an assumption without knowing all the facts, as we well know. I can say that for us, it's been really helpful having a really clear understanding of what that is. And we had a very sensible approach and a very proportionate approach to how we were looking at things. I think, that ratings and certifications come and go. And at the moment, we've got some great ones and I'm really excited about them. We've got to meet, the regulations. There'll be new ratings coming in and new ISOs that we're going to work with. But I think it's sticking to the frameworks and being true to looking at the trust, looking at what your clients want, looking at what all the stakeholders need, maybe the staff, why they come to work with you. I love it when I get colleagues coming up to me saying, oh, we came here because of the sustainability or responsible business, or because you're a B Corp, or because of the EcoVadis Platinum. That's pretty massive.
Amazing. Yeah. And obviously super validating in terms of the approach that you guys are taking when you hear that kind of firsthand. Let's say we're getting real, essentially. We're getting real about what's realistic and we're really understanding, as you say, like what matters to our stakeholders. And then we're kind of producing strategies that fit with that. And perhaps that's what leads to certain targets that were previously set during that kind of Paris Spring when we were slightly more overly positive and optimistic about achieving some of these goals. We've rolled back on some of those. What happens next? I want you to get your crystal ball out. What do you see as the future for sustainability within the banking sector? What does it look like?
I think we're going to see more on value, on social value. I think we're going to see more on delivery. The regulations are going to be ever evolving. And sometimes I'm afraid we do need them. We need them because of the carrot and stick scenario. No one wants to be at the front because of the cost and that first mover, challenge around it. But there's also a first mover advantage around some of that as well. No one wants to stand up and have their head above the parapet around, hang on, what are they claiming? Let's look at that. I think we also need to be a little bit forgiving. And I'm not suggesting there's room for negativity here, but I think we need to say, okay, I'm trying to do better tomorrow than I'm doing, every day you're trying to do incrementally better. And I think we need to celebrate some of those successes. So when someone's being able to reduce their portfolio, in certain areas, or to actually be part of that transition, that should be celebrated. And alcohol this week. London Climate Action Week last week. What I found so refreshing was being at things and hearing people from more controversial industries talk about some of their challenges and their journeys. Because it's really easy if they say something for everyone to go, pile in on them because of whatever that particular controversial industry might be. But, some of them are really, really doing some incredible stuff at changing and moving the dial. And so I'm a firm believer of, hey, let's look at some of that behavior. Let's look at what works and let's look and see what we can learn from each other and cherry pick. We can't make it perfect tomorrow, but we can make it a little bit better.
Charlie, I love that observation that you've had from London Climate Week last week. Somebody else I was speaking to came up with a brilliant sort of observation on this point, where they said one of the things that we don't do enough of is acknowledge the impact of perhaps, yes, these controversial industries as they are now, but thinking about the impact that these industries have had in helping to build so much of the brilliant things that we've developed in the modern world. And almost if we don't acknowledge that, we miss the opportunity to bring those people, those human beings along the journey with us. And I thought that was such a good, I know it's telling you to suck eggs, but I thought that was such a good observation. We don't do enough to go, look, we're not saying that this is the future and we need to work with you so that we produce a new future, but we can also acknowledge the influence that you've had on building the present, which is significant.
I think it's is a really good summary. I think it was profound to the point where I was talking to people, and I'm not going to say who they are for the controversial industries, but I learned more from having conversations with some of the more controversial industries and those navigating clients within their, because that's also a really interesting part of it. The clients and clients, depending on how you're terming and how we work with people. Some of the challenges and how they're approaching it, some of them have been looking at this for 20, 30, 40 years ahead of others, and others are playing catch up. And so they've got some brilliant solutions, and some of the plastics, some of the extractives, the oil companies are looking at in terms of, with some of the work they're doing, and looking at some of the solutions. I was blown away. However, I'm also really conscious that some of them can't talk about it in a way perhaps that we might. Now, banking isn't necessarily, everyone, deals with the bank, and everyone eats food. Everyone breathes air. We do all these different things, and we all touch the ecosystem at some point. And there are nefarious actors within that, and that we all have to be really, really aware of. From, we have regulation to try and prevent any, nefarious activity. However, at some point within this ecosystem, the global system, we know that people touch, our system, our food, our procurement processes, our, the finances. And we have to be really careful in how we approach that. Obviously, we've got regulation in place to prevent and stop, and with sanctions and things. And, but at the same time, you've got to think about when you're looking at extractives, they aren't necessarily, some of the people working within it will have been the techniques and the talent we can get from them, and that we can extract, ironically, and be part of that transition, I think is genius. And that's, we should be looking more around what we can learn from each other. And I think for me, that was a step change moment.
I'm going to conclude now, Charlie, if possible, by handing over the magic wand. I'm fascinated to see, and again, the conversation's been fairly optimistic and has suggested a few sort of rosier outcomes ahead, but I'm keen to see what you'll do with the magic wand. If I was to hand it to you, Charlie, and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Right now, right this moment, looking at all the regulations, all the ratings, all of the rhetoric, I would change so that responsible business, or ESG, or sustainability, we stopped talking about all the acronyms and everything else, and that we moved away from primarily being judged by public pledges and to being just delivery, evidence of delivery, because that's the real answer. Have you achieved it? Everyone can talk about it, and some people can talk about it far more eloquently and beautifully. But what have you really done? Where is the evidence? Show me. So I'd like to see organizations recognized, not for making big promises, but for consistently helping clients transition responsibly. And that brings in that earlier conversation we had around, understanding what we can learn from some of those markets and some of those areas, but expanding financial inclusion, strengthening resilience and creating long-term value for businesses, your clients, your staff. And then, looking at those organizations that have gone through it, what they've done right and what they've done wrong, learning from that. So I think, I think doing that little bit better every day and making it about delivery.
Charlie, that's one hell of a magic wand usage. You've really got some good use out of it there, but that's a great suggestion. And actually, interestingly, aligns very closely with the kind of ethos that we have behind TrueMark and the idea of ultimately creating a level playing field around the quality of communication, the transparency of communication, and the impact that can then have on focusing on delivery. We don't need all these other markers and accreditations, etc., that are trying to do that job of saying we are correct in this particular area. If we have one mark which says whatever the organization is communicating about this particular initiative, it is transparent and trustworthy. So yeah, very much aligns with our own thinking. Charlie, brilliant to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time. It's been a whistle-stop tour, but I've really enjoyed unpicking all things banking with you. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thank you to Charlie Bronks for joining me on today's show. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trusted sustainability reports and communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.